You may have seen some comments ascribed to the Gauteng ANC leader. The Premier of the province, Panyaza Lesufi, told the Sunday Times over the weekend that it is likely there'll be a coalition of the ANC and the EFF in Gauteng, perhaps even in national government after next year's elections. At the same time, already indications of problems with coalitions involving these two parties in Joburg and Ekurhuleni. Meanwhile, the DA says it wants to launch what it calls the moonshot towards a coalition of other parties to keep the ANC and the EFF out of power. So far, it seems several oppositions parties are not that keen on that idea. They've been fairly critical of the DA's proposal. Dr Levy Ndou is a political analyst and a lecturer in politics and public policy. Dr Ndou, good afternoon to you. Thank you for your time. I mean, if you look at our political spectrum right now, we seem to have problems with coalitions on the left and problems with coalitions on the right. Does that mean that the rest of us in the middle are going to suffer if all of these coalitions stay as unstable as they appear to be?
Good afternoon, Stephen. Good afternoon to the viewers at home. As long as we have the system that is being practiced in South Africa today, wherein any party can enter into a coalition, do whatever they like, bully coalition partners, as long as there is no consultation with the general public on what are the specific areas that have to be agreed upon in a coalition, as long as you have leaders who will hide the details of a coalition to ordinary citizens, and at the same time having leaders who want to focus on positions rather than service delivery, we are constantly going to have instability, and of course, we are going to have constant change of leadership, because coalitions in our metros have actually taught us that it is easy to abuse motions of no confidence in order to remove those that are in power.
So you've actually drawn up a framework. What would you change? How would this framework work?
Well, the framework as proposed talk about what is enshrined in our constitution: openness and transparency. That political parties, before they go and enter into a coalition, they need to go back to the electorate and actually talk to the electorates about their intentions to enter into the coalitions, provide details of what is it that has been agreed upon in a coalition, so that ordinary members on the ground should actually know exactly what is entailed in the coalition. Another aspect of the model is that coalitions have to be legalized. There should be clear rules and regulations that are guiding coalitions, so that those that are seen to be doing something outside these coalitions should actually be punished, and ordinary citizens should therefore have to know exactly where they stand or where their leaders have actually erred. At the same time, coalitions should have plans that are service delivery orientated, so that when they fail as a coalition, it should not only be one party that has to carry the blame, but all parties that are in a coalition should carry blame, because they're actually doing this work together. And where they've been able to succeed in some projects, it should be all members of the coalitions that will then be able to take the credit, because they will all have participated in these activities. At the same time, coalitions should be conducted in a manner that limits instability and unnecessary change of leadership. We have actually seen that in most instances, some coalition partners would bring in unrealistic demands to those that are leading coalitions in order for them to be to benefit personally rather than the citizens on the ground. And that is why in that model, we say that whatever happens should be in the best interest of the people on the ground, rather than politicians themselves.
Are you then asking politicians to go against their own interests? So for this framework to be passed, I would imagine it might require a change in national government. Well, what I mean is that there'll have to be legislation through the National Assembly. There'll have to be a change to the law, probably the Structures Act, a couple of others. You would have to convince politicians that it's in their interests to do this. Do you think it is in the interests of politicians to do this, or do you think they would oppose it?
One of the fundamental arguments in this model is that ideology does not matter in coalitions. And that is why you need political parties to be able to come out clear where they've actually compromised. We've seen a situation where, because parties are aware that when they enter into a coalition, they have to compromise their ideologies. Hence, they don't want people on the ground to know why they are entering into coalitions and which areas are being compromised. So the basic issue here is that whether you like it or not, if you are put together to form a government, in one way or another, you'll have to compromise some basics of your ideologies. And that is why we get a situation where ideologies are thrown out of the window, principles are thrown out of the window in these coalitions. All that matters now is the issue of ensuring that there is governance, but in the main, having to build in the capacity of those that want to be in power in different levels of government. But equally, what will be very central for me is that political parties should come out clear, tell us what is it that they are agreeing upon, but in the main, citizens should not be the victims of coalitions, as it is the case in many metros in the Republic of South Africa.
At the moment, as I understand the legislation, after an election, after a local election, so let's just say an argument in a metro, an election in a metro, the argument comes later, then you have the clock starts ticking, and you have, I think it's 30 days to actually elect a mayor. Now, that made sense. You didn't want to have instability with no mayor. But it also means that people are then forced into coalitions because the clock is ticking. Would that be one aspect that's worth looking at? That if you put a time limit on the time you can go without a mayor, then you actually end up forcing people together, and so the coalition doesn't last. But, I mean, I can argue against myself very happily here, Dr. Ndou, because, I mean, if you don't put a time limit, you could go for ages without a mayor, and we've seen that happen too.
The unfortunate part is that, indeed, there is quite limited time given to political parties in order to form a coalition. But remember that in some instances, when this kind of limitations were created or they were brought forth, there was no thinking that you'd have politicians who might not put the interests of the citizens first. You never thought that politicians would be fighting and jostling around positions, and unfortunately, that is the case. What I would think should be the best way of doing all this is that if set rules are put on the floor, when people know what has to be done when they enter into coalitions, all these kind of problems might be avoided because political parties will actually be in the know of exactly what they should do, the do's and the don'ts when they come into a coalition. Another area which is very important is that politicians, because we are now moving into the terrain of coalitions, they should also be prepared to compromise in the interest of ensuring that there is stability in governance. But at the center of all this is that there should be a clear element of openness and transparency so that ordinary citizens should know exactly where the party that they voted for stands in terms of these coalitions. Another area of great concern is that there is constant instability in our metros. And I think political parties themselves should actually put it onto themselves to say, we are actually doing a great disservice to the electorate. In themselves, they should be the ones who are providing solutions in ensuring that we do not have constant change of leadership, because that has got a huge negative impact on stability and service delivery in local government.
I'm very interested in what you say, Dr. Ndou, but I can think of several problems. So for example, I was struck in Panyaza Lesufi, the Premier's comment that it seemed likely that the ANC and the EFF would work more closely together, because it seems to me that some people who would be thinking of voting for the ANC may not like the EFF, and so they might not vote for the ANC because it's working with the EFF. The same goes the other way. Some people might think, well, I would like to vote for the EFF because I believe in radical change, but if they're going to work with the ANC, I'm not going to get radical change, I'm going to get, I don't know, you know what the EFF says about President Ramaphosa. So, the question would be then, could parties risk quite a lot by saying that they'll vote, that they'll work together?
The unfortunate situation, Stephen, is that voters have got their own patterns of voting. And with the results of the elections, we are in some instances presented with a situation where parties are forced to work together. That is why I said earlier on that when these coalitions are formed, in some instances, principles are not taken very seriously, and ideologies also occupy the backseat. During the local government elections, most political parties made bold statements that they are not going to work with Party A or Party B. And what we're seeing unfolding is exactly the opposite, because there are parties that are now appearing to be shifting towards the very same positions they said they are actually not going to be adopting. What will be very important in my view is that as long as we've got coalitions in South Africa, political parties themselves should be able to find ways and means to work together in the best interest of South Africa. There are instances where coalitions would be formed even before elections, and that is where ordinary citizens will then be able to align themselves whether they will prefer to vote for Party A or Party B. We have seen political parties coming together in Kenya to form what we call a grand coalition. We have seen political parties now in Zimbabwe who have actually formed a party, an organization of different political parties. In South Africa, it can happen before elections for parties to come together, make an agreement. It can still also happen after the elections. But what is central in my view is that services should be provided to the people. Politicians must ensure that there is stability, and politicians themselves must find ways and means to be able to work together.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Levy Ndou. Really appreciate it. Political analyst and politics and public policy lecturer. Really do appreciate the time.